On June 22, 1941, the world witnessed a turning point in the Second World War when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. This operation marked the beginning of a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. With a long border shared by the two nations, Germany aimed for a swift and decisive victory. Early that morning, the German forces advanced with surprising speed and efficiency. Soldiers, tanks, and aircraft poured across the Soviet frontier. The Nazis had meticulously planned this operation and believed that a quick victory was essential. Their main goal was to eliminate the USSR as a military threat and to seize its vast resources, particularly oil and agricultural land. What followed in the days and weeks after the invasion was a series of rapid territorial gains for the Germans. They quickly encroached into Soviet territory, capturing major cities and inflicting heavy losses on the Red Army. The speed of the German offensive took the Soviets by surprise. Many of their troops were not fully prepared for such an aggressive attack. Within the first month, German forces had reached the outskirts of key Soviet cities like Leningrad, Smolensk, and Kiev. Their initial success created a sense of invincibility within the German high command. They believed that the Red Army would collapse under the pressure of the invasion, much like other countries they had previously conquered. The invasion also aimed to secure the resources of the Soviet Union. Germany sought to exploit the vast agricultural lands of Ukraine and the rich oil fields in the Caucasus region. Controlling these resources was seen as vital for sustaining the German war effort and securing the Third Reich's future. However, these early victories came at a cost. The Germans faced stiff resistance from Soviet forces who were fighting for their homeland. Despite being caught off guard, the Soviet military began organizing counterattacks, determined to push back against the invaders. As the days passed, it became clear that the initial momentum of Operation Barbarossa might not last. For every territory gained, there were signs that the Soviet spirit and resolve were beginning to awaken. This conflict would soon evolve into one of the largest and deadliest battles in history, drastically changing the course of the war. Amidst the chaos of Operation Barbarossa, a crucial communication error occurred that would have serious consequences for the German forces. As the invasion progressed, German commanders became increasingly confident in their abilities. They had achieved rapid gains and believed they understood the positioning of the Red Army. However, this confidence soon turned into overconfidence. Unbeknownst to the Germans, the Soviet forces were not defeated as they had assumed. Instead, the Red Army was regrouping and preparing for a counteroffensive. But because of the communication failure, German intelligence misinterpreted the situation. They underestimated the strength and readiness of the Soviet troops. Messages that should have provided accurate assessments of Soviet movements were poorly relayed or misread. As a result, German commanders made strategic decisions based on incorrect information, believing that the Red Army was in disarray. This led them to push deeper into Soviet territory, thinking their victory was closer than it actually was. While the Germans were advancing, Soviet leaders were organizing their forces more carefully than ever. They began to mobilize their troops, fortifying positions and planning counterstrategies. Many soldiers, who had earlier faced overwhelming odds, were now filled with determination to defend their homeland. They had learned from their mistakes in the early days of the invasion and were ready to fight back. This miscommunication became a turning point. As the Germans continued their advance, they moved further away from their supply lines and became more vulnerable. The Soviet Union, by responding effectively and regaining its strength, was preparing to strike back. The misjudgment of the battlefield situation would soon have a significant impact on the effectiveness of the German campaign. What began as a confident invasion was now turning into a complex conflict, where both sides were adjusting to rapidly changing circumstances. The Germans, while initially dominating the battlefield, would soon find themselves facing a more resilient opponent than they had anticipated. The misjudgment of the battlefield situation reached a crucial point during the Battle of Moscow in late 1941. As the German forces confidently advanced, they set their sights on capturing the Soviet capital, believing that seizing Moscow would lead to a swift end to the war. However, they underestimated the resolve of the Soviet defenders and the harsh winter conditions that lay ahead. As winter approached, temperatures plummeted and snow blanketed the landscape. The German troops, who were not equipped for the brutal cold, began to suffer from frostbite and exhaustion. The freezing weather took a toll on their morale and efficiency. While the Germans had planned for a quick victory, they found themselves facing an unyielding Soviet defense. The Soviet leadership rallied its forces, knowing how critical it was to protect their capital. They organized a strong defensive line and launched counterattacks against the German positions. The soldiers, motivated by the desire to defend their homeland, fought fiercely. They were determined to prevent the Germans from capturing Moscow, which had great symbolic importance to the Soviet Union. As the battle unfolded, the Germans faced heavy losses. The combination of fierce Soviet resistance and the biting winter made their advance increasingly difficult. Supply lines became stretched, and many German soldiers were not prepared to fight in such severe conditions. By December 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive gained momentum. Soviet troops began to push back against the German army, marking a dramatic shift in the war. The Battle of Moscow ended with the Germans unable to take the city, a significant failure that shifted the tide of the conflict. This battle was more than just a military loss, it was a turning point in the war. It proved that the Soviet Union could stand its ground against the seemingly unstoppable German forces. The resolve of the Soviet troops during the harsh winter demonstrated that they were willing to fight harder than ever, setting the stage for future battles. This determined defense of Moscow marked the beginning of a prolonged struggle that would eventually lead to significant changes in the outcome of the war. The failure to capture Moscow had serious consequences for the German army. It created a ripple effect on the Eastern Front, where confidence began to wane among German soldiers and commanders alike. What had started as an invasion filled with optimism turned into a challenging struggle that tested their strength and resolve. As news of the defeat spread, the morale of the German troops began to plummet. Soldiers who had once felt invincible were now questioning their leaders and the feasibility of victory. The harsh winter conditions and significant losses weighed heavily on their spirits. Many troops became tired and demoralized, questioning whether they could continue the fight. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union seized this moment to create momentum on their side. With the failure to capture Moscow, Soviet leaders rallied their forces and called upon the people to defend their homeland. There was a newfound determination among the Soviet soldiers, who were inspired by the successful defense of their capital. They knew they had to fight back to reclaim their territory and secure their future. The Soviets launched a series of counteroffensives, using the element of surprise to catch the Germans off guard. These offensive movements were not just strategic, they were fueled by a deep sense of patriotism and a desire to protect their families and their land. The resolve of the Soviet troops, combined with their growing strength, allowed them to push back against the Germans. As the winter continued, the tide of the war started to change. The Soviets, now fighting with renewed vigor, began to gain ground. Areas that had once been occupied by the Germans were gradually being liberated. The relentless efforts of the Soviet forces aimed at pushing the Nazis westward started to show results, and the front line began to shift. This period marked the beginning of a prolonged struggle, but it also ignited hope among the Soviet people. The resilience shown during these counteroffensives not only boosted morale, but also altered the course of the war. The battlefield was no longer dominated by the German forces. The Soviets were standing their ground and fighting back, setting the stage for the battles that lay ahead. As the war dragged on, the unexpected outcomes of the failed invasion and the subsequent battles highlighted the complexities of warfare. Even minor mistakes could dramatically change the course of history. The German army's misjudgment during Operation Barbarossa had significant repercussions, and the initial overconfidence turned into a fight for survival. On the Soviet side, the resilience shown during moments of crisis became a source of national pride. Every small victory was celebrated, and the spirit of the people grew stronger. They found unity in adversity, and tales of bravery from the front lines inspired many back home. The defense of Moscow and the counteroffensives that followed were not just military actions. They became symbols of hope for the entire nation. As the Soviet forces continued to push back against the Germans, the narratives of ordinary soldiers fighting alongside their comrades captured the imagination of the public. Heroes emerged from these struggles, and their stories resonated throughout the country. The soldiers, women, and men alike were determined to protect their homeland and show the world their strength. While the war raged on, the Soviet Union's growing sense of resilience fortified a belief that they could overcome the odds. The hardships faced during the earlier phases of the war transformed into a collective consciousness that transcended individual battles. The simple act of standing firm against the invaders became deeply intertwined with their identity, a testament to their unyielding spirit. This newfound national pride fueled not just the military efforts, but also bolstered morale on the home front. People rallied to support the war effort, pouring into factories and production lines, contributing to the supply of arms and resources needed for the ongoing fight. The communities came together, filled with determination to back their troops and ensure victory. In this way, the war became more than just a series of battles. It became a defining moment in Soviet history. Each challenge faced and overcome symbolized their strength and unity. The lessons learned through the struggles on the battlefield would echo for generations, reminding everyone that resilience, in the face of adversity, could indeed shape the future. The impact of the Battle of Moscow continued to resonate throughout the rest of the war. This battle marked the beginning of the Soviet counteroffensive initiative, changing the dynamics of the conflict. It signaled to both the Soviets and the Germans that the tide was turning. With newfound confidence, the Soviet forces began to regroup and strategize. They understood that they could no longer just defend against the invaders. It was time to take the fight back to the Germans. The lingering spirit of resilience from Moscow fueled a series of offensives that would eventually lead them to significant victories at Stalingrad and Kursk. At Stalingrad, the Soviets faced one of their greatest challenges yet. The city, which had historical significance, became a symbol of determination and endurance. The fighting was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. However, the Soviet forces, emboldened by previous successes and their will to defend their homeland, managed to encircle the German troops. This maneuver led to a historic defeat for the Nazis, marking a key turning point in the war. Following Stalingrad, the momentum continued to build for the Soviets. At Kursk, one of the largest tank battles in history took place. The Soviets prepared meticulously, knowing that this would be a crucial moment. Their defenses were strong, and they counterattacked with determination. The successful defense at Kursk solidified the Soviet position and dealt another significant blow to the German army, which was beginning to show signs of wear. These victories did not just reflect military achievements, they were a signal that the Soviets were capable of pushing back the invaders. The confidence gained from these battles contributed significantly to the eventual downfall of the Third Reich. Each victory inspired further action, creating a ripple effect throughout the Red Army. As the war continued, the lessons learned from the early missteps during Operation Barbarossa were no longer forgotten. The Soviets had transformed their strategy and approach, fighting back with determination that would eventually lead to their advance into Eastern Europe and beyond. The successes at Stalingrad and Kursk were pivotal moments that not only boosted Soviet morale, but also marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany.